T was late October 1992, deep in the jagged, ancient mountains of southern West Virginia. It was a time of year when the Appalachian forests violently strip off their autumn colors, leaving behind millions of bare, skeletal branches that scrape against a low, bruised gray sky. In the isolated, tight-knit coal town of Blackwood Creek, the air always smelled faintly of sulfur, damp earth, and bitter wood smoke curling from stone chimneys. When the sun dropped behind the steep, imposing ridges, it didn't just get dark, it became absolute. The temperature would plummet in a matter of minutes, and a thick, suffocating white fog would rise off the freezing river, swallowing the narrow, winding valley roads completely. For two young couples, that Friday evening was supposed to be the start of a long, quiet, well-earned weekend. Elias Thorne, 28, was a heavy machinery mechanic who spent his days with engine grease permanently worked into the calluses of his hands. His wife, Julianne, 26, managed the front counter at the local diner, known to everyone in town for her sharp memory and warm, constant smile. Joining them were Julianne's younger sister, Sarah, 24, and her husband, Marcus Vance, 27, who worked the early shifts at the nearby lumber mill. They were a fiercely loyal family unit, bound by the kind of deep, generational roots that only exist in small mountain towns where neighbors are practically blood. They had just pooled months of hard-earned savings to purchase a foreclosed, off-grid cabin tucked miles deep into the wooded hollows, intending to fix it up, board by board, as a private family retreat. At 5:45 p.m. on Friday, October 23rd, Elias's heavy-duty maroon Chevy pickup pulled into the gravel lot of the county hardware store. The cashier, a high school student named Bobby, remembered them clearly. They were in incredibly high spirits, laughing and talking over one another. They bought 2 heavy canvas tops, a massive box of galvanized roofing nails, a thermos of hot black coffee, and a high-powered flashlight. Elias paid with a fold of cash. Julianne smiled and waved to Bobby through the glass door as they walked out into the biting cold. By 6:15 p.m., the heavy, rhythmic rumble of the Chevy's engine faded as the truck turned off the main paved highway and began the slow, treacherous, winding ascent up the rutted date road into the hollow. Bobby watched their red taillights glow for a moment before they were entirely swallowed by the creeping mountain fog. That was the last time anyone in Blackwood Creek saw the 4 of them alive. When Monday morning arrived, the heavy metal bays at Elias's garage stayed rolled down and padlocked. Across town, the morning rush of the diner descended into chaos because Julianne had completely missed her opening shift. At the mill, Marcus did not punch his time card. In the mountains, poor cell service, downed landlines, and washed-out dirt roads often meant people were out of touch for a day or two. But Elias was a man of strict routine, and Julianne had never missed a single shift in 4 years. By Monday afternoon, the heavy, sinking, physical weight of genuine concern began to settle over their extended families. At 4 p.m., Elias's father, Arthur, borrowed a neighbor's 4-wheel drive truck and navigated the steep, slick, muddy road up to the new cabin to check on them. He arrived just as the daylight was beginning to fail, the shadows stretching long and dark across the clearing. The maroon Chevy was parked haphazardly in the muddy grass beside the cabin. The tires were fully inflated. The windows were intact. But when Arthur looked in the bed of the truck, his heart skipped a beat. The 2 heavy canvas tops and the box of roofing nails were still sitting there, getting soaked by a light, freezing drizzle. They hadn't even unpacked their supplies. When he approached the wooden steps of the cabin, the unease in his gut turned to a cold, paralyzing dread. The front door was completely unlocked. The latch hadn't caught, and the heavy door was swinging open an inch or two, creaking loudly with every gust of freezing wind. Inside, the cabin was as cold as a meat locker, but the air was heavy with a sharp, acrid, undeniable smell of scorched metal. On the propane stove, a heavy iron kettle sat over an unlit burner. The water inside had been completely boiled away hours, maybe days, ago. The intense, unattended heat had severely warped the bottom of the metal before the propane tank had finally run empty. On the kitchen counter sat 4 ceramic mugs, an open jar of instant coffee, and a loaf of bread completely untouched. But the most unsettling, heartbreaking detail came from the back bedroom. Elias's prize hunting dog, a golden retriever mix named Copper, was locked inside. When Arthur opened the door, the dog was terrified, severely dehydrated, and whimpering. Deep, Frantic scratch marks covered the inside of the wooden door, proving the animal had been trapped in the dark room for 3 days trying to escape. Arthur knew his son better than anyone. Elias would never, under any circumstances, have locked his dog away and left him to starve. By nightfall, the West Virginia State Police and local county authorities had swarmed the property. The pitch-black wood was suddenly alive with sweeping, chaotic flashlight beams, the barking of K-9 units, and the harsh crackle of police radios. The initial search effort was massive. Hundreds of local miners, loggers, and shop owners volunteered, grabbing their own rifles and lanterns. They marched shoulder to shoulder through the unforgiving Appalachian terrain. They navigated steep, deadly drops, pushed through thick, tearing patches of mountain laurel, and skirted the hidden, terrifying dangers of unmapped, century-old coal shafts that littered the hillsides like open graves. Professional tracking dogs were brought to the cabin at dawn. They sniffed the seats of the Chevy and the floorboards of the kitchen. They tracked a strong scent down the front steps, moved deliberately about 50 yards into the dense tree line, and then simply sat down in the damp, rotting leaves. The handlers tried to push them forward, but the dogs refused to move. The scent had simply vanished. It was as if 4 grown adults had walked into the woods and been lifted directly into the sky. The theories emerged quickly, born out of desperate logic. The first assumption was a tragic accident. Perhaps one of them had gone for a walk in the dark, slipped, and fallen into an unmarked mine shaft, and the others had perished trying to perform a frantic rescue in the freezing fog. But the search team scoured every known shaft, crevice, and ravine within a 5-mile radius. There were no broken branches indicating a fall. There was no disturbed earth. There were no dropped flashlights or torn scraps of clothing. Then, as the days bled into a week, the rumors grew much darker. People whispered about violent, deeply entrenched drug operations hidden deep in the hollows. Had Elias and Marcus stumbled upon a dropped site while exploring their new land? Had they heard a noise outside the cabin, stepped out into the dark, and seen something they were never supposed to see? 10 agonizing days into the search, a chilling, deliberate clue was discovered, nearly 3 miles away from a cabin, on an overgrown, abandoned logging road entirely inaccessible by any vehicle. A volunteer searcher found a single, heavy leatherwork boot. It belonged to Elias, but it wasn't thrown into the brush. It wasn't dropped in a frantic struggle. It was placed perfectly upright, sitting dead center in the middle of the dirt road. The heavy laces had been meticulously untied and pulled wide open. It was a display, a message. Despite this bizarre, terrifying discovery, the physical search yielded absolutely nothing else. The bitter, brutal winter of 1992 rolled in with a vengeance, freezing the mountain ground solid and covering the hollows in deep, impenetrable snow. The search grids were officially abandoned. The command tents were taken down. Months turned into years. Then, decades. The story of the Blackwood Fall became a dark, terrifying local legend. The abandoned cabin in the woods was eventually consumed by creeping ivy, rot, and neglect, slowly collapsing in on itself. The parents of the victims grew old, their homes filling with heavy cardboard boxes of yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and endless, unanswered questions. The town of Blackwood Creek slowly withered. The coal mines dried up and closed. People moved away. But those who stayed lived with a quiet, lingering paranoia woven into their daily lives. They locked their doors the moment the sun went down. They didn't hike the hollows after dark, because they knew that whatever had swallowed an entire family without a single trace was still out there, hiding in the trees. Then came the spring of 2025. 33 years after the disappearance, the region was hit by a massive 100-year storm. Violent flash floods tore through the valleys, ripping ancient trees from their roots, washing away entire hillsides, and carving deep new ravines into the scarred earth. A county road crew with heavy machinery was dispatched to clear massive debris near the ruins of an old, concrete coal tipple, located nearly 10 miles away from the original cabin site. The brutalist concrete structure had been sealed and entirely abandoned since the late 1980s. While clearing a massive, tangled mudslide with an industrial excavator, a worker felt the heavy steel teeth of his bucket strike something hard. It was a massive corrugated steel drainage pipe that had been buried deep beneath tons of earth, rock, and concrete. The end of the large pipe had been completely capped and sealed with poured industrial concrete decades ago. But the sheer, violent force of the floodwaters had cracked the concrete seal, splitting it down the middle. When the crew climbed down into the mud with flashlights and peered inside the dark, rusted, echoing pipe, the 33-year-old mystery finally broke open in the most horrifying way imaginable. Inside the narrow steel tube lay the skeletal remains of the Blackwood Four. State forensic teams worked around the clock for days, setting up privacy tents and carefully extracting the fragile remains from the rusted, muddy tomb. Dental records and modern, advanced DNA testing confirmed what the town already knew in its gut. Elias, Julianne, Marcus, and Sarah had finally been found. But when the official autopsy results came back, a chilling, horrifying silence fell over the investigation room. There were no broken bones indicating a fall into a ravine. There were no bullet wounds. There was absolutely no blunt force trauma to their skulls. They had died of exposure and asphyxiation, but they hadn't crawled into the pipe looking for shelter from the cold. Wrapped tightly around the fragile wrist bones of all four victims were thick, heavily degraded pieces of rope. They had been bound. They had been forced into the drainage pipe, deep in the earth, and then someone had deliberately poured hundreds of pounds of wet concrete over the opening, sealing them in the pitch black to suffocate. The discovery immediately shifted the decades-old cold case into a high-profile, active homicide investigation. Detectives focused entirely on the fragments of rope miraculously recovered from the victims' wrists. It wasn't cheap hardware store twine. It wasn't standard farming rope. Forensic analysis revealed it was a highly specialized, expensive braided nylon rope. Specifically, it was the exact type of static rigging rope used exclusively by professional high-angle search and rescue teams in the early 1990s. Even more disturbing than the material were the knots themselves. They were incredibly complex, flawless figure-8 follow-through knots. The kind of knots tied only by someone with extensive, professional, repetitive training. Cold case investigators pulled the original, dusty 1992 search log from the archives. They cross-referenced the names of the men who had access to that specific, locked county-issued rescue equipment. They looked at the command structure. They looked at who had drawn and mapped the search grids. The overwhelming forensic evidence pointed to a single name, a name that made the lead detective sick to his stomach. William Bill Vance. In 1992, Bill Vance was a highly respected commander of the county's volunteer search and rescue squad. He was Marcus Vance's own uncle. He was a man who had drawn the maps for the volunteers. He was a man who had explicitly, deliberately directed the search dogs and volunteers away from the abandoned coal tipple, claiming on the official record that the area was too dangerous and structurally unsound to search. He was also the man who had stood in the local church basement week after week, pouring coffee for Elias and Julianne's weeping mothers, holding their hands, and promising them he would not rest until he brought their children home. In 2025, Bill Vance was 74 years old. He was a retired, celebrated community leader. He had a comfortable pension, grandchildren, and a brass plaque in the town hall honoring his decades of selfless public service. When unmarked state police vehicles silently surrounded his property at dawn, the arrest struck Blackwood Creek like a physical, devastating blow. The town was paralyzed with absolute shock. The man they had trusted implicitly, the man who had literally led the search for the missing family, was led out of his home in handcuffs, his face completely devoid of emotion, faced with a highly specific, undeniable forensic evidence of the specialized rope, the professional knots, and the sealed concrete that only someone with municipal access to heavy machinery could have orchestrated seamlessly. Vance's defense completely collapsed. The horrifying timeline finally made sense. He had likely used his emergency lights to pull them over on the dark mountain road that Friday night, or met them at the cabin under the guise of an official emergency or a family visit. They trusted him. He was family. He was an authority figure. They let him bind them, perhaps thinking it was a misunderstanding, a joke, or a bizarre protocol they simply couldn't question from a man in his position. To avoid the death penalty, Bill Vance pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. He stood before a judge and was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a maximum security prison. But the closure of the town of Blackwood Creek had prayed for was entirely empty, because throughout the entire, exhausting legal process, during every intense psychological interrogation, and even as he stood before the weeping, broken families of the victims in the courtroom, Bill Vance absolutely refused to speak. He offered absolutely no motive. There was no financial gain to be had. There was no documented history of a family feud or prior violence. He simply stared straight ahead with cold, blank, empty eyes, refusing to answer the only question that truly mattered to the people he destroyed. Why? The families finally have their children back. The 33-year mystery of the Blackwood Four has been legally solved. But the DAC? Suffocating, agonizing reality of why they were taken, betrayed by their own blood, and subjected to such a terrifying end remains entirely buried inside the mind of monster. The hollows of West Virginia are quiet again. The cabin is long gone, reclaimed by the earth. But on nights when a gray fog rises from the river and swallows the winding roads, the silence in Blackwood Creek feels heavier, colder, and far more sinister than it ever did before. Every case we cover takes time to research because these stories deserve to be remembered. If you want more cases like this, consider subscribing.